Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us here on The Conversation. My name is Shelleygan Petersen, and I'm joined in the studio by one of the youngest parliamentarians in Hengari. And today we will be touching on, something we celebrated when the announcement came of who will be taking up seats in the National Assembly. Young women were at the forefront of that when we heard and when we saw the lists. Now, today we will be touching on a few issues, but primarily women empowerment in Parliament. And just a few weeks ago, we celebrated Women's Day, but International Women's Day, Namibia's Women's Day, is a bit later in the year. But every year, the International Women's Day and our National Women's Day is met with criticism that no real good is done to ensure that women are truly empowered in different sectors. And one of them, and what we're focusing on today, as I said, is Parliament. Thank you very much for joining us, Ina. It's such a privilege to have you here.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yes. As I said, you're one of the youngest parliamentarians in our National Assembly. Let's just look at your experience, just detail that for us.
I think from the onset, one must make it clear that it has been very, very hectic. But I think going into the political structure, our political party structure, and from the very beginning of the processes, we were very clear on the fact that it was not going to be easy. It was not going to be an easy journey. We didn't expect it to be an easy one. And so, to some extent, we were prepared for the work, for the criticism that came with it also, and also the expectations, really, because, being in a position such as this really gives you a whole lot of confidence also, because you understand that you're no longer representing yourself, but you're in a position to carry forward the agenda of your generation and generations to come. But so far, it has been a very exciting journey. I feel privileged and honored to be someone at my age in a position that I am, to regard myself as a representative of all Namibian people, in fact, as the Constitution in Article 63 I says. And I think the support from our political structures and also from one another, and the strength that we draw from one another as young people in Parliament is also something that has kept us going and just keep moving forward and really thinking ahead.
Yeah. Is it true that they say sort of the political space, especially the National Assembly or Parliament as a whole, is a man's world? And how do you fit in as a young woman there?
Yeah, absolutely. It is a man's world. I mean, you look at the prehistorical context of our country. Remember that Namibia has a deeply seated colonial inheritance of where we had women marginalized and sidelined when it came to some of these formal structures, and even politics itself. Even now, when you go to the rural areas of Namibia, you find that more men compared to women partake in political activities, or are more driven or more drawn to partake in this political activities and exercises. It is a man's world, but I think one of the things that you learn from the onset as a young person is that all odds are really against you. One, you're young, so that means people will undermine you. Obviously, they will undermine you and call you a child. They will think that you don't have anything to offer. They will think that you're not prepared. You do not have the knowledge nor the experience, in fact, to be standing in front of an entire parliament, really, whose average age stands at 40-something, and say something and be listened to. But I think it gives us strength, and one of the guiding principles, I think, has been to always be informed. I think the job is twice as hard, twice as difficult for a young person, because you have big shoes to fill. You have to be informed, you have to be well read, basically all eyes are on you. Everybody's waiting for you to fail. But I think the support from our peers, civil society organization, also just support from within our own political organization keeps us going.
Yeah. Let me just touch on something you mentioned is the knowledge and experience. The First Lady, when she took part in a African Women Leadership Talk. She said one of the things that she's seen all over the world is, especially in Africa, as a woman, you're not protected from being undermined when you're at the table, from people questioning why you are there, why you have a seat at the table. Has there been any specific time or event where you can remember in the National Assembly when someone did make you feel like they're undermining why you're there and the fact that you are there?
Yeah, absolutely. Numerous occasions. I think the very first time was quite recently. In fact, I think this month, if I'm not mistaken, when I was called a child by Minister of Tourism, Honorable Shifeta, called me a child. But I think I've been prepared for this. And I myself internally have been telling myself, these attacks will come. They will try to undermine you. And that is basically what happens. In fact, Shifeta's one was even the most recent. I remember when the situation was, my loan came up some time ago last year. The minister said, I asked about the situation about NASFAF. How do we improve the capacity and ensure that we have given this institution enough sort of support to go a long way in supporting and funding students in the country? And when she answered, in fact, she answered through a ministerial statement, and she said, it is because of people like Hengari who have not paid their loans and so forth. But be that as it may, I've always prepared myself for that. I think those are just minor attacks. They don't really go a long way. I've always thought that they would have come at a much, much earlier stage. Because remember that we have transitioned, I myself has transitioned from student politics to national politics. So there's always carried over beef, to say, sort of that thing where this was a student that was fighting me when, you know, she was serving in the structure, and therefore I need to come for her or discredit her, because I think that's one of the antiques or strategies they use, is to try and use anything from your personal life to really discredit you, so that next time you're unable to stand in front of Parliament to make a case about a situation, for example, to discredit you so that your own peers do not listen to you. But I think it's quite normal, considering the area and the environment that I serve in. I mean, it's a man's world, and I think it's a difficult area and arena, but one must always be prepared for those attacks and must be ready and always just stay focused and keep moving.
Yeah. Do you think Parliament is sensitized to women's issues?
Tricky question. Yeah. I don't think Parliament is not sensitized. Let me answer it that way. I don't think Parliament is not sensitized about women issues. I think, though, we can do better. Parliament can do better in terms of advancing women issues. You're talking about gender-responsive budgeting, for example, which is a new concept, but one really understands what the concept talks about when you look at women as a marginalized group, right? And if you look at the principle of affirmative repositioning, we're talking about people who have previously been disadvantaged, and how do we bring those people forward, you know? Then we talk about the principle of equity. We begin to talk about the principle of equity. So yes, Parliament can still do much better. I mean, you look at the National Council, because remember that when we talk about Parliament, it's not just the National Assembly, okay? We think about the National Council and National Assembly.
Yeah.
I know that some years ago, the National Council, in collaboration with the UN Commission, established sort of a committee for rural women in Parliament. And that was later, it is now called the Women Caucus, right? National Council Women Caucus. And that it is mainly aimed at really advocating for women, promoting the rights of women, and also just encouraging leaders in government to bring young women, and just women in general, really, in formal structures, in positions of decision-making and positions of power. Parliament can do much better, really. We're looking at a women caucus that hasn't met. I mean, it's been a year now in Parliament. I haven't heard of a women caucus that has set to really just discuss national issues that are faced by women. There are a number of issues, particularly referring to SGBV, sexual and gender-based violence, for example. Why wait for young people to take onto the streets to demonstrate if we know there's been a rising number of cases in terms of sexual and gender-based violence? So I think Parliament can be more proactive in terms of addressing some of these women issues as well.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to put you a bit in a hot seat here.
Mm.
If we look back at last year, there was an incident that happened where a journalist came about a group of women. Basically, it was a fellowship group where women in Christ came together and they talked. And a lot of women from the National Assembly were in that group, including your fellow member that is Dienda. And the topic in Parliament was the abortion topic, but essentially women's reproductive rights. And there was a workshop, and they were to discuss it. And I know one of the comments from the SWAPO members, who is now the Namibian ambassador to the US, that is Margaret Menza Williams, who said that they want to divide the House on the issue. How do you perceive that? I mean, women parliamentarians, MPs outside of the National Assembly discussing an issue where they want to divide the House on abortion, a very big national issue that has been discussed for so many years.
Look, there's a saying that women are a disorganized majority that is led by an organized minority. And it's very true. You must understand that because of this generational divide, there's been sort of a gap in terms of addressing and just having open and frank conversations about women issues, issues around sex, issues around gender, and how one identifies sexually. But I think in terms of that particular exercise, it has been an ongoing sort of fault in our system, where the older generation is really not as open to discussing some of these things. And I think it is quite a great injustice. It does a great injustice to the people that we represent. You see, if you look at Article 63I of the Constitution, it talks about the functions of Parliament. And one of the most important functions is found in sub-article I, and it says to represent all Namibians and to ensure that the scourges of apartheid, colonialism, and discrimination do not in any form manifest themselves, in the coming future or in the present, right? And I think generally, really, women have been very disorganized in Parliament in terms of trying to advocate for, or in terms of advocating for women issues. I think women can do better, can be better organized at bringing women issues sort of to the table. Because if you are a divided majority, you will be led and will continue to be led by an organized and a unified minority group.
Yeah. Also going back to the Shut It Down protest, I remember the day that the first day after the first demonstration, it was discussed in the National Assembly, and you were there. It was quite a hectic, a very emotional discussion, and moved on to the third day and the fourth day. And now, just recently, a few weeks ago, we had the topic of the gendered insults constantly happening in Parliament. You had the Minister of Gender make some comments in Parliament about a man keeping in his AK-47 in his pants at a time when still SGBV, sexual and gender-based violence, is such a problem. And recently you had one of the members of Parliament, that is the LPM leader, Bernarda Swartberg, call another parliamentarian infertile witch. Now, we had a very emotional debate when it came to SGBV, when the protests were going on. Parliamentarians were touched by it, and they said it's absolutely necessary for us to discuss SGBV and empowering women. But outside of that protest, you have constant insults to parliamentarians based on their gender, based on their issues. How do we go about that? What picture does this bring out to the public and to women out there, firstly? And secondly, is it okay for women to say they don't take parliamentarians seriously?
Look, I think as someone who grew up organizing demonstrations and protests, I 110% understand the frustration that sometimes we express even on social media platforms when talking about sensitive issues. And it is not a today's frustration. You must understand that it's a frustration that has been boiled over and has been boiling over for the last couple of years. But I think we can do better at really when we approach people in these positions that we have put them into, there's a better way to do it. If you have a minister, for example, who's in charge of an issue that you think is not critically being brought up or being discussed or deliberated on, I think the approaches that we use as young people will also determine the outcome and sort of the influence that we have on the outcome of that particular issue. In terms of the insults, the gendered insults in Parliament, I think as representatives, and this is my conviction, that it is as representatives of a sovereign people, we must be able to draw lines. We're not kids, you know. You must be able to draw a line and say, I'm in a position of representation. I'm representing the needs, the ethos and the principles of the people that have brought me here. You also remember that you also serve at the behest of that political party. And that's the tricky part, really. I think a lot of times when we complain about certain policies or certain policy interventions not being taken seriously, or certain social ills not being taken seriously, try and look at it from a perspective of this person, number one, yes, is there to represent me. I voted them into that position. But also, the person also serves as part of a political party structure where they are expected to behave a certain way. They are expected to respond a certain way. But I think that only works mostly with the ruling party. And I'm saying this because it is the most honest thing, really. When you look at the ruling party, most of the time, the reason why you don't see, especially the backbenchers, the members who are voting members but do not serve in cabinet, are not ministers nor deputy ministers, the reason why you hardly ever see them disagreeing with, say, a motion brought by a minister on the floor of the House, or there's a discussion that was initiated by a member of cabinet, it is because of an informing that they have, an ideological information or position that or principal position that they have taken as members of that political party to say, if I say this, I will look as if I am against the party. And it is a dangerous element in our politics. Because if we are saying we are there to serve the people of the country, why not be genuine? Why not have this frank conversation? Because why take things personally? If I'm talking about, if you're the minister, if you are Honorable Doreen Sioka, for example, and I see that there are certain areas really that you can improve, why should it be seen as a personal attack, or me coming for the party, or me not complimenting central government when I offer my ideas to say, Honorable Minister, I think when it comes to the building of facilities, for example, for women who have gone under or gone through abuse, maybe we should go this way, right, to reach this particular point. So normally, I think there's always a disconnect between party interest and national interest, and it's costing this country, and I think we ought to fix that.
Very interesting that you mentioned that. If we look at sort of the party interest, as you say, versus the people's needs, or the national needs, the country's needs, shouldn't it be aligned then? If we look at the parties, different parties, not just the ruling parties, coming into the National Assembly and saying, listen, we need A, B, and C, and D, it's because of the manifesto during the campaigning time. Should that not then align to national issues? Because if you look at that manifesto, it speaks to national issues. But why should there be such, you called it, it's a tricky part. Why is it tricky if it should not align with one another?
Look, there's the element of, I want to come back to Parliament in the next 3 terms, or for the next 3 terms, I want to remain in Parliament. And so I feel as though I must be able to buy face, which is a very unfortunate state of affairs, or I must be seen as though I'm representing the party, or serving the party's interest, or hold the party's interest at heart. Look, we have taken on a very dangerous political culture in our country, not just in our country, in Africa, because it's also happening in South Africa, where, you know, we have encouraged hand clapping as a democratic exercise. And one must really study that particular element and sector of understanding. Because if you look at it, most times politicians reward people that clap for them, or sort of support them even when they are wrong, when they know they are wrong. And I think it's a dangerous state of affairs. It's costing our country, it's costing Africa. I think, and I believe deeply, it is my deep conviction that every leader must aspire to have someone who corrects them even when they do not like it. Of course, platforms matter. What platform you bring it on, when you bring up a certain issue, platforms matter, approaches matter, and I think that's where the tricky part comes in. Learning and mastering the art of just correcting our own leaders in these political structures that wherein we serve.
Yeah. Do you have someone who corrects you whenever you are, perhaps whenever you bring something to Parliament?
All the time, absolutely. And I think it's a culture that I've taken from our president, Honorable Venani. He's a man that really, really listens. I think I've also mastered that art of knowing when to sort of go in and say, hey, big boss, I think maybe we should change this approach, And as young people, there are a lot of different styles, really, that you can use to sort of maneuver your idea, also get people to agree with what you're trying to say or understand your perspective on issues. Remember that as young people, you are much more excited, enthusiastic, and have much more vibrant ideas, but not everybody will always be able to relate to those ideas. And so it is an art in itself, being able to convince a 78-year-old man like Honorable Nico Smith to go and say, hey, but Honorable Nico, I think we should do this way and that. But I think it also teaches us about intergenerational transfer of knowledge and experience. Because I'm not an ageist, but I believe that, and that's why I believe that as young people, we also have a role to play in this intergenerational transfer of ideas, of skills, of knowledge, of experience. And it is an art in itself. It's not something that you can master in one day. You must learn about the characters, the personalities of people, how they respond, what makes them tick, what is their ideological standing on certain social issues. That way it makes it easier for you to really sort of penetrate a certain sector or someone's just a mental thinking on something or mindset on something.
Yeah, let's look at just Parliament this session and the previous session. The previous session had 46% women representation. Let's look at what do you think they have achieved and done for women in the country. And we'll get to this one now. But what do you think the previous woman in Parliament did for the country?
Yeah, it's difficult to answer that. But I don't want to answer in sort of, and I hope you're not looking for like the tangible things that they have done, but I think they sort of ushered us as young people, young females in society into this new era where it's okay for young people to sit on boards, for example, boards of companies, where it's okay for young people to serve in formal structures. So I think that generation of women or that sort of parliament really ushered us into a new era of thinking and mindset and just our outlook on things also. But I think from their shortcomings also, there were lessons that we took. Women not talking on issues like economics, women not being able to express themselves on issues of industries, industrialization, the budget itself, because I think if you are playing in a men's arena and you want men to respect you, and you want people to respect and understand or listen to you, you also have to master the game. You want people to know that you're capable, you're ready, and you're informed. For example, we're always saying in the last couple of years, women were not as vocal on women issues. Rather, we found that more men, in fact, there's a study, more men spoke on women issues compared to men. Yeah. And that says something, that tells us something. But also, not just that, I think the conversation should be extended further a little bit. Women should be able to partake in conversations also that do not necessarily have to do with women issues, for example, economics, finances. Because if you want people to listen to you, I must be able to take you seriously, and by you showing that you're able to do your job or you are an informed person, you really earn your place in the game.
Okay, you said that your first point was they have sort of made way or ushered away. But how did they do that? How did women being in parliament sort of usher way for young people and young women?
I think through different platforms. I remember before I got into parliament, I was parliamentary researcher. So I was still at parliament. I had an office at parliament under the PDM. But I always sort of understood or learned from the debates in parliament, for example. Like I said, the shortcomings of women in the previous session was also a learning sort of or stepping stone for us to see, look, if they can't do this, why can't I go in to also do that or to try and do this differently? But most importantly, I think the participation of women really in different processes, whether it is the election process, whether it is, in fact, I think there was more contestation of women in formal structures the previous session than any other year. I think women were more vocal on issues, not women issues, but they were vocal, not just in parliament, but also on social media. There was that sort of small connect with those on the ground, those outside parliament. I think because of that relationship that they were able to build with the people outside, one really could learn that we can actually do this. I think when I'm in that position, I'm also able to transfer knowledge, or I'm able to better represent or better be vocal or vocalize women issues and be a better advocate for women and girls.
Yeah. Let me just take you back also to what happened during the previous parliament. And something that keeps on coming up was the issue of the sanitary pads, the issue of parliamentarians saying that they are too shy to speak about it. What was your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was disappointed. Look, I think we need to self-evaluate. We need to really reflect sometimes. When you serve in a public office, you don't serve in your own interest. You don't serve your own interest. You don't serve your own agenda. And I think that's one thing we must be able, it's a conversation that ought to have taken place already, really, to prepare women, whether of the older generation of this generation, about this. But I think when I first heard about it, I was quite disappointed. Because remember, as researcher, my job was also to write speeches and so forth, prepare motions. And so when we were following the discussion, even remember that sanitary conversation sanitary pads conversation came in 2016 already. When Honorable Mchenry Venani tabled that motion. Yeah. And I remember the former member of parliament, Madam Pendukeni Ivula Itana, said, no, but what are you trying to prove? There are already grants, social grants. But I think that reasoning also comes from a lack of understanding, really. Because if you're talking about social grants and you're talking about sanitary pads, how are those two interconnected? Is there a link between the two? Social grants for orphans, I remember that's what you said. No, government is already giving social grants for orphans. What are you trying to prove by bringing up a conversation about making sanitary pads free or tax-free? And one really, when you really sit back to think about this, you actually think, you actually made to understand that it is maybe from a lack of understanding. But most importantly, I think even this year, there was a conversation, that was a motion introduced by the Deputy Minister of Health. And she wanted to talk about abortion, but from a sexual health perspective, for women. And that motion lapsed and was never reintroduced again. And I'm pretty sure there was some sort of maneuvering backstage to say, no, we're not going to talk about that. But it is a serious crisis that we have in our country. We must have an intergenerational dialogue with people that we have found in these positions to say, look, we must become a parliament that is responsive to the issues of the day. If the rights of gays and lesbians becomes an issue, or has become an issue today, it must be discussed. We must discuss it. We are representing Namibian people. We're not representing our own beliefs, our own principles. No, representing all Namibian people. And so if there is a need to discuss issues that are sensitive to us in our personal capacities, then we ought to put our personal beliefs and values aside. Because now you understand that I am no longer in Hengari. I am a member of parliament and I'm serving in the interest of all Namibians. So this conversation is not about whether I'm comfortable to talk about sex, whether I'm comfortable to talk about sanitary pads. It's not about whether I'm comfortable to talk about being lesbian or gay or any other matter that has always been considered as sort of sensitive. And I don't like the fact that we always call them sensitive issues. I don't even think they're sensitive issues. I think they are critical issues in society that must be addressed head on.
Yeah. Speaking about the LGBTQIA plus community and the recent protests, why hasn't it been discussed in Parliament? The demonstration, the Shut Down demonstration was discussed in Parliament the same day. After each, and I think for 3 days it was discussed. Why hasn't this issue been discussed?
I think because there's an ongoing case in court. Remember that. So because I think this is the worst. And I hate to use it. It's the worst excuse politicians use. The matter is
sub judice.
It's sub judice. It is being discussed in court, and therefore, to avoid interference into judiciary, we cannot discuss that matter. But I think generally the discussions are taking place with the organizers of the demonstration. I spoke to Omar, who's also one of the organizers of the demonstration. Look, our position as the Popular Democratic Movement is very clear. We are saying that you cannot govern someone's sexual affairs, someone's bedroom affairs with politics. There's no way. Politics has no place in someone's bedroom. So we are absolutely 110% pro-choice. If you choose to associate yourself in a certain way, I think it is our obligation as Namibians to protect and represent all Namibians. Remember that our constitution speaks about discrimination. So when we are talking about discrimination, in what aspect are we talking about discrimination? Is having these conversations about the LGBTQI community not discrimination? Us not talking about it is actually discrimination. We are discriminating against a certain sector of our population in our country by not talking about it, and also by not taking initiative to solve and try and help them out of some of these issues.
Yeah. Earlier, before we started recording, we started speaking about sort of the transitioning from the older generation to the younger generation. You see for the last how many years the same parliamentarians are recycled in, and it was celebrated when you and your colleagues in the National Assembly took your seats and started discussing, very uneasy topics. We have the motion, and essentially it's become such a positive outcome from Parliament. That was the 6 offenders register. We also have the notice of a motion, which was introduced by the Deputy ICT Minister, Emma Phyllis, but essentially it was the Minister of Finance during the budget speech gave the good news. But do you think, how often should women issues be discussed in Parliament? Should it say, oh, it's about that time of the month that we discuss it? No. And do you think the older generation is a bit skeptical about discussing women issues, not just issues about sanitary pads, but if we're going to say women will be considered when we have these applications and have these these vacancies sent out, they and the previously disadvantaged will be considered first and all these issues. But when you look at institutions, women are still at the bottom of the management of just the structure of the companies. You have the judiciary, for instance. They have a lot of women there, but they're quite lower in ranks. And the judges, from across the board, from the Supreme Court to the Magistrates Court, the magistrates themselves, mostly occupied by men. When do you think that change will come? Are we still too early to speak about it as a country that's 31 years old?
The issue of women empowerment, and in fact the process of advocating for women empowerment didn't start with our generation. It's not a new issue. So why must there be a timer to say, oh, now it's that time of the month, we must now begin to talk about women issues? I think at every chance we get, we must talk about women issues. as a previously and formerly marginalized group of people. In fact, women are still marginalized today. In its current form, our socio-economic dynamics do sideline and do marginalize women in many ways. Yes, there is an absolute disconnect between the older generation and current affairs. And that is brought about by the lack of sort of interactions with the grassroots. Look, for you to know what's really happening or what is people's position on certain issues on the ground, the average Namibian, what are their thoughts? What is the thought of an average Namibian on unemployment? What is the thought of an average Namibian on gender-based violence? If you do not have that interaction between leadership and grassroots, there will always be a disconnect in the approaches, in the way you address. In fact, it even goes as far as saying in how much effort you really put in solving real issues that affect the average Namibian. So I think that disconnect can only be taken away when we encourage grassroots interaction, when we say leaders must go back to the people, go back to the electorates, even before elections. Go and have conversations with civil society organizations. Go and have conversations with young women who have been struggling, who have been victims of sexual and gender-based violence. Young women, rural girls, particularly rural girls, who have not had access to sanitary pads, who have not had access to the opportunities that are afforded to boys in urban areas or even in rural areas. Because once you're brought up in a rural area as a woman, your chores are already outlined for you. There are these gender roles that are attached to you as a human being. So already when you're born, people already say you're going to give birth. Your job is to give birth, milk cows, give birth, look after the kids, right? We still have that issue in Namibia. We still have an issue of child marriages in Namibia, right? Even in Africa, there are issues of girls where they do not have access. In Namibia particularly, colleagues, we must talk about women issues at every chance we get. At every chance. There will never be a perfect time. There will never be absolutely and perfectly ready to have that conversation. And so we must always encourage it. Every chance we get, we must talk about women issues.
Thank you very much. Now today, here in the conversation, we'll be taking some calls from you. We want to hear what you have to say. We want you to be part of this engagement. So please give us a call on 083 877 3701 081 877 3701. Please give us a call. We'll have your call live here in the studio, and you can give us your views. Now let's just go back. Do you plan on touching on a woman issue and bringing a motion to Parliament this year, especially because there are a lot of issues? If you look at the demonstration, there were a number of issues that were brought up, but some of those, demands were never met, and no one is holding them accountable.
Absolutely. Look, the reason why some of this, even some of the recommendations that are made in petitions do not make it even to Parliament is because the process itself of receiving petitions, the National Assembly, that process of receiving petitions from demonstrators or petitioners is flawed. Why? I don't think once a petition is received, it should go automatically to committee stage. It must be discussed. Do you understand? We must have a discussion about the recommendations. What is the issue? What are the recommendations? What is the way forward? That sort of thinking must already be established on the floor in the National Assembly before it is handed over to the committees that deal with the social issues. I tabled a motion just this month. I want the House to debate the challenges, structural challenges that exist to access to higher education. And access to higher education, particularly access to higher education, because you see, we have an issue where young girls are graduating, more girls compared to boys,
yeah.
Right? But what happens to them after graduation? What happens to them after graduating from secondary school? Do they have the necessary support that they need to get into higher education, and not just financial? I'm a rural girl coming from Okatana, for example. I don't have access to sanitary pads. I don't have access to proper financing. I don't have access to housing, you know, accommodation, just simple things. But this must be discussed. Why? Because through that discussion, we're able to really establish that gap, that divide between the needs of a young man and the needs of a young woman. But I think it's important in our advocacy also, and I must say this, it's important in our advocacy as young women and as women in general in society that we do not create an idea of them and us. We must be able to advocate for one group that we feel has been marginalized over the years without making the other group feel as though they do not matter in society, or they are not important, or their issues are not heard. Right? And I think it's an important balance to maintain and to establish.
Speaking about that, it makes me touch on that national reconciliation debate. The one that basically turned around the National Assembly last year. It ended almost every day with that discussion. They couldn't go on to other motions because there was no consensus on the issue. And it was the discussion of, you know, one group being recognized more than the other one and bringing down the other group. As a young person, how was it looking at that discussion?
You expect the sort of your elders, right, or these people that are older than you, to sort of approach matters also differently and in a much more matured way. If you're going to talk about national reconciliation, whether there's a need for it or not, I think the courtesy, I think we ought to afford each other the courtesy to listen to one another without already having or preempting what someone is going to say and already having a response before you even hear what this person has to say. The national reconciliation debate was a very important debate in that it showed us how far we've come in terms of how open are we really to discuss issues that are close, that hit close to home. And these are issues of tribalism, for example. How ready are we? How matured are we as a country in our democracy? How matured are we in our democracy to be able to, are we mature enough to have this discussion or not? And I think already that showed us that we're not ready at all. But interestingly, you find that government has in place policy documents that speak to affirmative repositioning, that speak to marginalization, redressing marginalization, that speak to equity. But these are issues that talk about a group of people previously marginalized or previously sidelined or previously not afforded or having been afforded equal opportunities as compared to other groups. So I think it's quite ironic that we couldn't get through the debate, but I think it was an important debate and it showed us how far we have come in our democracy.
Do you think Parliament is a direct representation, or the National Assembly, let me speak to that only, is a direct representation of our society? Why I ask that question is, if you look at that debate, and you spoke about tribalism, and it very strongly came out of that debate, do you think that truly represents where the country as a whole is?
Yeah, absolutely. 110%. In fact, and I think this is very contradictory to say, but I think even the insults, sometimes when people complain about insults, I laugh because I think they would have done the same thing. But I think, although I still maintain that as leaders, there's a certain decorum that we must maintain. There's a certain behavior and level of thinking that we must always maintain in that sort of formal structure. But how members of parliament react, how they think, most times is a reflection of the society or the communities that they come from. These are frustrations that they're expressing on behalf of their members, whether they're doing so in the right way or not. These are things that we pick up. It's the same as someone wrote a comment on Facebook one day and they said, sometimes I just think some of these people were raised wrongly. It is like that, really. But it's a foundation that we have laid for ourselves, that has been laid not just by our parents. Because remember, yes, there's that childhood foundation that is laid before you go through high schooling and whatever. Yes. But there's a foundation that is laid through your exposure to issues in society, through difficulties experienced, through challenges that you are experiencing as an ordinary Namibian, that would inform your behavior, that would inform your thinking, really, and how you react to certain situations. So I think Parliament is an absolute reflection in itself of our people in society.
Yeah. Before we do, we're seeing the calls are coming in a bit slow today, but before we do end of the conversation, let's just look, what is your message for the young ladies who are aspiring members of Parliament?
Yeah, when I started, we just turned a year. I mean, it's been 1 year since we've been sworn in as members of Parliament. And I remember that when I gave my maiden speech, I said one of the people that I look up to is Dr. Libertina Madila, who's the former Deputy Prime Minister. And I'm saying this to say, in fact, she's not the only person that I follow. Even the current First Lady, Flon, Madam Monica Genkos, is someone that I also listen to. We are different in our political aligning, right? But I think it's important that as young people, you are able to find people that you will listen to that do not necessarily belong to your political party, but that you know you can learn something from. You know, it is important to always maintain a discipline, in that it doesn't matter. Doesn't mean that when someone disagrees with you or you disagree with someone, then you cannot listen to them or you cannot learn from them. I think it is through the contestation of ideas that you are able to learn. I mean, the Flon was talking about these issues of engendered insults, for example. These are things that we are going through as young women in politics, by the way. And so it is just right to acknowledge that at least there's someone speaking for you. You must be able to find a role model, number one, not just a role model. Your mentorship, you have to find a mentor, someone who will guide you in your doings. It's important that you also remain a very informed person. It is part of your national duty as a citizen to always be informed about issues in your country and also learn from others. You don't know everything, but there will be times that people will make you angry, and that's fine. I mean, the other day someone was telling me that, you know, when you come into politics, you must be able to say thank you even when someone says "Futek," and that's just you know, because you're expected to there's a certain level of behavior and standard where people hold you.
Yeah, we have someone on the line. Good afternoon, Loide. How are you doing? Can Loide hear us? Loide, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, perhaps you can just speak to her. Loide, can you just tell us what is your view, what is your question or your information that you'd like to share with us?
All right. Thank you so much for this platform. I have a question. I've been listening on the whole discussion, and I would just somebody who's from the public.
Yeah.
Could Ms. Hengari please just maybe give some recommendations? If somebody is a woman like myself wants to start up in Parliament, what are advices? Where does one start? Maybe courses or is it politics related? How would you advise somebody to start up? If I foresee myself wanting to join into Parliament one day,
okay,
how would you advise me to start?
You mean in terms of educational path that you need to take?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So what Loide is saying is, how should a young woman, in terms of what do you study first of all, and then maybe we can also go into what associations do you then join to ensure that you have your way set to get to Parliament?
I don't think there's a memo, you know, to get to where anybody gets. It's not just with Parliament; it's with different structures. It's even just serving as a board member. I don't think there's a memo as to go through this, go through that. Remember that Parliament is a representative organ of people with different backgrounds, different expertise. So there's no one particular field or career that you must follow or path that you must follow. But I think what is important is that you're able to find a passion to serve others. You must find a passion for something. And if that passion is to serve others, then you're able to serve in a structure, whether informal or formal, and you're able to identify sort of what path am I going to follow then to get there. Am I going to join a civil society organization? Am I going to start a civil society organization? Am I going to be a founder of an NGO? But I think from the onset, really, it is about finding a passion. What is it that you are passionate about? And through that, transform that into sort of begin to look at how you can use that to serve others and to help others in your community. But I think some of the courses that one can do really just to understand local governance. There is a course at the University of Namibia. It's called the Local Government Studies. I think it's a diploma course for 2 years. There is another course now that was just introduced. It's a political science degree that is also at the University of Namibia under the Faculty of Economics. And so there are just a lot of things. You can even study law. Remember that serving in parliament is not just limited to one career path. You don't need to be a lawyer or a political scientist or an accountant or just that to serve. I mean, you can be an IT guru and still be able to serve in parliament as long as you know that I'm using this IT techniques, or I want to use sort of my experience in the IT industry to transform the national IT industry into a more forthcoming industry and more modern.
But we don't really see in terms of, let's say, independent candidate coming for parliament. So you need to have to join a political party, if it's not incorrect?
Yes, remember that political parties have to contest for seats in parliament. So you have to go through a political party structure. You can join my party, which is the PDM.
Advertising!
Yes. That's just a joke.
That was a smooth one. But one thing, before I let you go, we didn't touch on it. Do you think Parliament has effectively dealt with sexual and gender-based violence, first of all, and then women empowerment? Just in a few words.
Not yet. We are busy with the Combating of Rape Act, Combating of Domestic Violence Act. We are now we're introducing, the Minister of Justice has even in fact gone as far as incorporating the idea of introducing a sex offenders register, which is something that my party brought to the table. And we are very proud of that, and we are forward looking, and we're looking forward to that. But that discussion it started this week, the debate, continued this week, but I think we'll continue to next week, or maybe when we conclude with the budget. But there are serious amendments to both bills or to both laws that, if introduced, government will be in a better position to combat rape and also to combat domestic violence.
Last few words that you'd like to add before we do conclude this show.
Last words, politicians who don't finish. Look, I think it's important that as young people, and my message is directly to young people, I think it's very, very, very important that as a young person, you are informed about national issues, contemporary national issues. It is important that you're informed about the national budget, which is something that speaks to what is the share of the youth, what in terms of budgeting, how much money is being allocated to ministries that deal with youth development in essence or in general. What is your share in the national cake as a young person? So you must really be informed about some of these policies. And also, there's a document, the new document launched by the presidential advisors. In fact, it was their initiative, this HPP2. I remember the other day we were having a discussion at NAST about the HPP2, and I think generally we always agree that Harambee Prosperity Plan in itself has always been an overly ambitious plan. And so you as a young person have now a role and a duty to really read this document. What does it say about youth development? What do I gain from it? And what do the leaders of this country really stand for? What is the philosophical and ideological position as it pertains to the decision making that affects young people in general? Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us. It has been an absolute pleasure to have you. And I know some of you are wondering why Sozi Mwazi couldn't make it. We had this decided to just move a bit away and just ask Ina's idea of what the experience has been in Parliament, especially for a young woman. We celebrated the idea, but now we need to understand how the experience has been as well. And that's why we had this engagement. Thank you very much for joining us. We are reading your comments. Do not worry, we're not just commenting for Mohala, but we are reading it. We are taking your suggestions in. So keep on engaging with us. And thank you very much for watching us once again. Have a great evening and a good weekend.